Hi, Facebook friends. This is Helen Archontou, CEO of the YWCA of Northern New Jersey. So happy to have this time with you this evening on Wednesday. We're so grateful that you could join us for this very important conversation, and so grateful to have these wonderful panelists pulled together to help us explore this discussion. This town hall that the YWCA of Northern New Jersey has pulled together is a conversation to discuss systemic racism. And our goal this evening is to create awareness, to provide a more in-depth understanding of how embedded racism is in all aspects of our society. We know that racism, systemic racism, definitely is an issue in the criminal justice system, the employment issue, employment systems, housing, healthcare, in politics and education. Tonight, with the help of our speakers and our experts, we will do a deep dive and look into three systems in particular, and talk about the facets of racism, how they impact these systems, and the lasting imprint that they're having. And you know, recently there's been so much focus on law enforcement as a system, which we understand because of so many of the tragedies that have made the headlines, and so many of the tragedies that have not made the headlines, but that we know still are occurring. But we wanted to make sure that our community understands that law enforcement is not the only system that is impacted by racism. And we also wanted to learn a little bit about that, and possibly, hopefully, at the end of this conversation, gain some more understanding. And for those of us that are looking to be allies to the Black community, hopefully some actual tangible actions that we can take to be supportive. And so with that, the YWCA of Northern New Jersey and the YWCA of our national organization has been on the forefront of social movements for more than 160 years, and here in Northern New Jersey for 100 years. This is not a new topic for us. We are dedicated to helping address this issue of inequality in our society. At the present time, though, we have refocused our energy and put together a series of conversations that we've been holding for the last few weeks that were really born out of conversations we've had with the Black leaders in our communities. And we are grateful to all over the last few weeks that have been part of those discussions and helped us educate and understand these issues and get more clarity around them. So let me start by saying what I want to make sure is hopefully we want to make sure everyone understands is that racism is not, it's not the problem of the people who suffer with it to solve it. It's the problem, it's all of our problems, and it's around all of us and all of our responsibilities to together understand it, acknowledge our part in it. For those of us, you know, that are, you know, white, or understand white privilege, understand these issues, and to educate ourselves how to dismantle it. Right prior to kicking off, I made the comment about the system being broken, and you know, Twinkie said that she, you know, always laughs at people saying that the system is broken, and Sue offered, well, it's not broken, it's acting the way it's supposed to. That's how it was created. And that's exactly the kind of discussion that we're looking to have here today to, you know, give us all a better understanding. And really, again, to understand that the systems that we are talking about, our schools, our communities, our workplaces, our government, every domain in society is impacted here. And so with that, I'll introduce each of our speakers individually, and then collectively we'll have a panel discussion. I'm so grateful to start with our local hometown hero, our sheriff, Anthony Cureton, our Bergen County sheriff. He's been a law enforcement professional, community leader with more than 28 years of experience keeping Bergen County families safe. And as sheriff of the largest law enforcement agency in the state's most populous county, he leads a team of 600 officers and civilians who are committed to safeguarding close to 1 million residents living in our 70 municipalities in Bergen County. He was born and raised in Englewood, New Jersey, and he proudly served as a police officer in his hometown, and most recently served as the director as of inmate social services and education for the Bergen County Sheriff's Office. As a veteran of law enforcement, he is a member of the FBI Law Enforcement Education Development Association, the National Chiefs of Police Association, and the New Jersey Chiefs of Police West Point Alumni Association. He also teaches criminal justice as a professor at Ramapo College of New Jersey in Mahwah and Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, and as a guest lecturer at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. In addition to his distinguished law enforcement career, he has a he's been long time committed to making a difference in our community and giving back. He was the longtime president of the Bergen County branch of the NAACP, and he recently served on Governor Murphy's transition team, as he served on numerous boards of directors, including those for cavalry care after school programs, the Martin Luther King Jr. Senior Center, Care Plus New Jersey, and the Bergen County African American Advisory Board. Sheriff Cureton was actually recognized by the YWCA of Northern New Jersey in 2019 as one of our racial justice honorees, and many other organizations, prestigious agencies have also honored him because of all of the wonderful work that he has done. So with all that, welcome, Sheriff Cureton. Thank you for making the time to be with us this evening.
Good evening. How you doing? Anything for you, Helen? You know, you call, I come running.
Well, I'm always grateful for that. I'm always grateful for that. And I really am saying thank you for making the time, because those of us who live in this area and are active in the community know that you've been everywhere in the last few weeks and been part of so many marches and protests and speaking, on this issue, which might seem, odd to some folks to see a sheriff, actively participating in these discussions. So it's definitely unique. So I thought it would be good to start with, just to, create a baseline understanding. Can you talk a little bit about how you think systemic racism has impacted law enforcement?
Ooh, how much time we have? About 3 hours now. That's something, unfortunately, be ever present in law enforcement that dates back beyond my years. You're too young to know about that stuff. But systemic racism has affected law enforcement, will continue to affect law enforcement till we're able to really convince everybody to look at their biases, acknowledge their biases. And I think once we do that, we can probably galvanize law enforcement a little bit more and have that open communication where, unfortunately, we'll be fortunate enough that not to have these negative interactions with the community. But again, it's all focused on the bias. If you can't change that mindset, again, law enforcement is going to be on a crash course, in which, of course, we don't want that. But it's a challenge. So with that, the concerns of I'll speak from a personal standpoint. The concerns of being stopped for the color of my skin. It's a reality. As a law enforcement practitioner, sometimes it's just the baseline of our work. Not necessarily being suspicious. You try not to classify a group by their colors and hope in their actions being associated with it. But that bias in itself becomes so, how can we put this, ingrained in the officer's mind. It becomes a daily habit, to say the least. And those are some of the things we have to identify and say, hey, we can't have this anymore. We got to look at the individual for who they are, look at the infraction for who it or what it is, and we govern ourselves accordingly to that.
Oh, that makes sense. So I know because, as I said, for those who, aren't aware, you've been out in the community speaking, on this topic for the last few weeks, which I'm very grateful, that you've, been out doing that. And so we know that you've spoken a lot about unbiased policing and police accountability. Can you talk a little bit about how these fundamental principles help us address and resolve long-standing structural damages within our law enforcement system?
Can I get 2 vowels on that? Fundamental principles in addressing. I'm sorry, it's such a wide open discussion. Yeah, I'm trying to again, it's going to take a while. Yeah, we know it's a structural damages dealing with bias, but let's separate law enforcement from itself. And I'm always going to go around robin to this. The individual themselves, how do we fix them? And I think once we learn how to fix them, everything else will fall into play in addressing it. Hello? I think I'm having technical difficulty. If you can hear me, wave at me. Okay. Helen, how you doing?
I think she's frozen.
Okay, there we go. There we go. So how are we going to resolve this? Resolving this is educating our officers. Attorney General Office, they put out something some time ago called CLEAR, which is the cultural enforcement, essentially telling everybody how to deal with various cultures. And it deals with the biases and how we're going to have the officers identify the biases of each culture and find a way of course, at least redirecting their opinions about certain groups. And I think once we establish that, once that is more focused in law enforcement, we'll be okay. The only thing, it has to be tested. And I think testing, or the objectives have to be tested and see if they are they proven. And that's the hardest part when you're dealing with different cultures. So I think we need to have more practical application, maybe more practical interaction with different groups to change the mindset of officers. As with everything in life, we're guided by what we see every day. So I use an example. In the 90s, used to have the movies that portrayed certain communities one way or another. And people tend to see that community and believe that's the actual lifestyle of everybody in that community. But you have to have that conversation with the law enforcement community, with the officers, and say, hey, what you see here is not necessarily reality. And I think once they grasp that and embrace that, it also breaks down the line. But I must say, being pro law enforcement right now, we cannot let the one incidence of Derek Chauvin. I try not to pronounce his name because he's disrespected the occupation, but we can't let his action paint a face or a negative face upon law enforcement. So it's that one incident that unfortunately painted a negative image on law enforcement. So the question that goes beyond law enforcement into everybody, how do we correct it? Mm-hmm. And I think that has to be a collective discussion. It just can't be one-sided. And the willingness to open your ears and hear what the other person is saying. So.
And I know that our Attorney General here in New Jersey has hosted some, listening opportunities and has, brought together a lot of law enforcement to do a deep dive, in these discussions and look at these matters here in New Jersey for us. And I know you're actively part of that as well. So Sheriff, there's a lot of conversation that's been happening the last few weeks about the movement around defunding the police. Mm-hmm. And it's gained a lot of attention and it's gained a lot of momentum. And many people feel that reallocating or redirecting funding away from the police department to other government agencies will help reduce crime and with that, reduce violence. What are your thoughts on that model and whether or not it's impactful, to help us address systemic racism in law enforcement?
I don't believe defunding is the answer. Reallocating funding to more training, training that can be measured. I think that's the best way we need to go about it. I'm a firm believer, and I'm pretty sure we all share the same mindset. Law enforcement is going to be here. We're going to need law enforcement for our daily survival. To take money away from it, it's going to do nothing but hamper the advancement of where we need to go. The question is taking the money, bringing the resources necessary to law enforcement to deal with that mindset. And I think that'll correct everything and provide a little more direction. I mean, it's an occupation we know it's many years old, but the question along the line, have we really applied this funding or open up more educational opportunities to train our officers better?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate you for, starting with us and, helping kick off our conversation. I'm going to switch our focus a little bit over to a different system. which is the entertainment system, which obviously is hooked into all TV, film, and with that also a lot of our news outlets, are connected there as well. And we're so grateful to have Tracy, who's known as Twinkie, Byrd, to join us to be part of this conversation. A little bit about Twinkie. She is a 30-year veteran known for casting such films as Stomp the Yard, Notorious, Fruitvale Station, Sparkle, and most recently Beats on Netflix. She's embarked on many new ventures, which she calls lane changes. I love that. As director, producer, and author. Her Sankofa style directorial debut and The Counter, 1960, received standing ovations at the MVA-AFF, PAFF, and I know these all stand for things, I don't know what they are.
Yes.
Sorry. They're all film festivals. I know what FF stands for, film festivals. I don't know what the other ones are. And the Power of She Film Festival. I know that one.
Yeah.
I know that one for sure. And she co-wrote The Counter, 1960, alongside with Reverend Jesse Jackson's teenage daughter, Ashley, and co-produced it with Kim Ogletree, which I've seen, and it was amazing. Twinkie also directed 2 episodes of the web series God Complex for Amazon Prime, music video for Billboard. She's a recording artist, a music video for Billboard recording artist Drew Vision, and scenes for Jig Reels Productions. Currently, she's the executive producer of Christmas Unwrapped for Lifetime Network, and her latest venture, Channeling Becky by Kindle Publishing. Is a book based on a collection of Facebook blog entries. Her focused take on dating in the new millennium in Hollywood, mental health, self-love, and self-care will change your life.
Yep.
So welcome, Twinkie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I have to update that now because the most recent that people have seen of my work is the Clark sisters. Yeah, the sheriff liked that, I think. You can talk, Sheriff.
We'll have to.
I might start singing.
Oh, awesome.
So Twinkie,
Yes.
So we know that implicit bias is, something that is, embedded in all of our work, no matter, where we are, because we're carrying it within us. And,
Right.
So it's impacted. And these biases are ingrained, in decades of, television, news channels, movies, messaging. For example, I'm Greek. Most people think Greeks own diners, right? I mean, that's a very common, connection that people make. So, and we know that there's, a lot of other connections and biases that people have. So can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how systemic racism has impacted the entertainment and media industry, and how we think that it's, possibly reinforced, obviously, these stereotypes?
Can you see me, and am I clear and moving well?
You're a little frozen from my perspective. I don't know for the others.
Am I still frozen?
I believe you are.
Sorry.
Twinkie, it's okay. Twinkie, you want to exit out and come back in?
Frozen?
I'll go to Dr. Esquilin, and then we can come back to you. So Dr. Esquilin, we're going to switch gears.
Oh, now she's frozen.
Oh, wow.
Twinkie, can you answer do you remember what she asked?
Yes. Well, I actually have the questions right here on my phone with regards to implicit bias and the whole industry. The whole industry it's created on it. Honestly, when you look back at hopefully you guys can hear me, when you look back at Birth of a Nation in 1915 and how that was shown at the White House, we are talking about racism at its finest, and bias, and just infusing fear into the general public with visuals. So that is the beginning, and that's still being taught in most film schools as, you know, a controversial film, but it's also being taught in film school. So it's something that we fight and we battle every day, but because we are so incredibly brainwashed and programmed by it, it's one of the most important things. I encourage people of color, of all ethnicities, to get into storytelling, into film, into television, writing it. But first, we have to deprogram ourselves from the programming we were given. Because, you know, we come to a place where we believe, because of the educational system, that we have something to prove. And if we knew our truth, we would know we have nothing to prove, because we are the first everything. Did that answer your question?
She's frozen again.
Hope that answered your question. Are you coming back and coming? There she is.
Yes.
Yes.
I hopefully, yes. I heard your answer. Maybe I was frozen, but I heard your answer. And thank you for it. Thank you. So that's interesting to hear about. It's interesting to hear about kind of deprogramming and reprogramming, you know, yourself. So can I ask, what are some ways that you recommend folks do that? What kind of journey have you had to go on to do that?
It's been a journey. Traveling has really helped me. The Schomburg has helped me considerably. I love to read, so reading has helped, but it's also been important to do some YouTube excavation. Hidden Colors has helped considerably. The documentaries, Hidden Colors 1 through 5. I believe 5 is the most recent. I haven't seen that one yet. So it's been a process, and it's still a process of excavating and of uncovering my and I use that, you know, such basic things that when you think about it, it's like it's so deeply ingrained, and it happened even before, you know, before elementary school, when you're starting to talk about nursery rhymes, and when you speak about fairy tales, that all of that has started even before you get into school, to learn the lies that were taught to make you feel less than. Even when you think about the word that I never use, which is minority, that is a subliminally that when who when you think that's a subliminal mindset warfare right there. It is created to make you feel less than and minor. So it's a journey, and it's a process. I mentor a number of teenage young people that are filmmakers, and I work with the Nate Parker Foundation, and we explore and create films around, you know, their vision and how they see the world. They're college age young people. And one of our mentees did a pitch the other day. And in his pitch, in terms of pitching his short film, he said, "A prisoner, ... And then we had to stop him and go back and say, well, who is he? What's his name? What is, like, you break it all down. I said, so you see a person in prison a particular way, and so you think a prisoner is the way to describe a Black man in his early 20s who, and that is the mindset that he has because of the programming."
Right.
Whoo, it's work.
That sounds very powerful to really, you know, refocus the discussion in that way.
It really is.
So I know that you're a casting director.
I am.
And you know, thinking about being in that role, you know, how is it that you work on pushing representation, you know, in film, in the you know, different arenas that you're working in, to make sure that Black people and people of color are represented, and, you know, how that impacts exactly what you just talked about, the image of something like a prisoner, and
Right.
with that.
Right.
role.
Or a bride or the bad guy. That creating, I just had a recent conversation about creating the Clark sisters, and a question came to me on my Instagram live about creating the bad sister as the dark-skinned sister. And I said, first you have to figure out what it is that you believe good and bad is, and what you were fed, because what you were fed was the good witch wears and the bad witch wears.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where that comes from. So if the good witch wears white and the bad witch wears black, then the darker skinned person is the bad person. And so I have to combat that regularly when you're looking at the lead, the antagonist and the protagonist. Whose story is this? Why is this person fair, or why is this person good? And why is that other person bad, or why? And how are we going to connect those dots, and how we're telling that story? So for me, I'm always paying attention to it, just because of my education, my deprogramming, and I'm always bringing it to light for the filmmaker. If it's not me, I bring it to light for the filmmakers that I'm working for or with, that we have to be really careful in terms of tone and complexion, unless we're telling a biopic like Fruitvale Station. Then, we are trying to cast it as close to Oscar Grant as possible, and to tell the truth, as much truth about that story as possible. And thankfully for that, and unfortunately for that, at the same time, there was quite a bit of YouTube footage of the actual occurrence. So we recreated it exactly, and then cut to the YouTube footage that was the real footage. So that's a part of the casting, but it's also a part of my mindset. I have a commitment to it and to my community, but I have a Sankofa mindset. I really want the past to inform the present. And I usually share that with the young people that I work with.
And I know we hear it so often from young people when they read a book or see a film, that they, and young Black children, young Black adults, when they see a film, see children, and see someone in the film that looks like them, right? And how meaningful that is for them, and helps them imagine and see themselves, differently when they have a positive role model, in these experiences.
Yeah, that's true.
So clearly it's important, that we get all casting directors, and, obviously not just Black casting directors like yourself, thinking this way in terms of, bringing people into roles with a wider vision of, just the stereotypes, that we have. So with that, thinking about the film Black Panther, right? And that was a film that obviously was a, blockbuster hit.
Yes, it was.
And, it, on the surface, right, would look like that meant that there was progress, for Black representation, and for Black filmmakers, and for Black stories. And I say on the surface because I think that was a lot of what, a lot of the rhetoric was at the time when the film hit, is how we really made a shift. But my question is, have we really made a shift? Did that film really have that type of impact, or is that just something that folks are holding into? And you're shaking your head, so obviously, yeah.
Unfortunately not. I mean, it made Marvel a crap load of money.
Yeah.
None of which was filtered into our community, other than the few people on the project that were Black or of color. But for the most part, it made Marvel a crap load of money. And there are none of us in Marvel. Marvel is very white. And the actual character of Black Panther was created by Stan Lee, well, two white men. So it's a great thing to look at, but much like Hidden Figures and the Green Book and a few other projects that I can think of, unfortunately, the other two don't give you a full breadth of the truth. you don't get to learn about those women. You don't get to know where they went to school. You're not learning how they were educated. You don't learn a lot of things. When it comes to Black Panther, yes, it looked really great. And I'm happy that young people especially were inspired by it. But to me, when I was younger and growing up, even till this day, the people that I was inspired by were my parents, Muhammad Ali, Florence Griffith Joyner. There were all kinds of people who I loved. And then too, it's about what kind of stories are we telling our children? What kind of stories are we sharing? And even though I am behind the scenes, I find that it's important to turn it off at times and to really educate and inform and encourage us to read, because we need our imaginations, and the imagination is very important. We also have stories that have not been told. We don't know anything about our stories before being enslaved, before being kidnapped. And so those are the kind of stories that I feel like are important to learn about. I don't feel like it's changed tremendously. Casting directors on that project were white. It's just that Ryan Coogler, who I worked with on Fruitvale Station, he embedded a lot of subliminal messages in the film, which I appreciate. So there was a lot of subliminal stuff, much like Get Out, a lot of subliminal messages in there for us.
Well, Twinkie, thank you for sharing your perspective. I'm grateful, and sit tight. We're going to come back to you and to the sheriff. And so for those of you watching, you can tell we're moving in very different systems here. Obviously, we started talking from law enforcement. You know, Twinkie shed some, very interesting light, on the film industry. And so now we're going to look in a total another direction, although maybe somewhat at times linked to law enforcement, which is the child protective system. Our final panelist is a colleague that I've had for a long time, myself, that I've had to, the great honor of working with, Dr. Susan Esquilin. She's a licensed psychologist, trained in developmental and clinical psychology from the University of Chicago, with a diploma in clinical psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. She served on the faculties of Montclair State, Rutgers, and the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. She's testified as an expert in criminal and family court and civil matters. She was part of the faculty that developed and taught the decade-long course sponsored by Rutgers School of Social Work and the New Jersey Department of Children and Families that trained psychologists and psychiatrists to function as expert evaluators in child protection matters. Dr.
Uh-oh, did she freeze?
Has presented both at state and national conferences and regularly teaches committees in Essex County. Oh, yes. She serves on the Model Court Committee in Essex County, and she's a member. She's a member of the Equity and Fairness, as well as Child Wellbeing subcommittees. She also serves on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the New Jersey Psychological Association, as in the co-chair of the Immigration Emergency Action Group, and is currently the president of Essex Union County Associations of Psychologists, and was named the New Jersey Psychologist of the Year in 2017. So welcome, Dr. Esquilin.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Esquilin, I know that you had a very long career working in child protective services. So can you talk a little?
I can talk a little
bit about the problem of racial and ethnic
disparities, right? I'll go. Okay, so, in New Jersey, we have DCPP, which stands for the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, which used to be known by most people as DIFAS, and that's the local child protective agency. And, most people think about that agency and the child protection system as something that works to protect children. That's what it says it's doing. But the stats and the reality is that entry into the child protection system, particularly for Black children, is often devastating. Just to give you some figures, compared to their percentage in the population, Black children are overrepresented, first of all, among those who were referred initially to DCP&P. They represent 13% of the children in New Jersey, but 30% of those who were referred for Child Protective Services. Now, once a child and family come into the system, the system may end for them at various points, but the deeper children and families go into the system, so children may be removed from their homes, they may be placed with non-kin or kin, but they can be placed with non-kin. They often, if they're in the system for a long time, have multiple moves in the system. They go from one home to another, sometimes into what we call congregate care. And they can be in the system for long periods of time. The deeper children and families go into the system, the more the disproportionality is evident. So when they've been removed and remain in the system, as an example, without ever achieving what we call permanency, that is, they're not reunified and they're not adopted, we use the term aging out. That's like the final problem in the system, where you get to the end of your time in the system and you don't have any family. And those children then enter adulthood without any familial safety net. So as kids are approaching that point, we say we're still planning for them. Let's say you have a 16-year-old, we're planning for them. And the label of the plan is independent living rather than reunification or returning home. When you look at that population, so we said when they enter the system, Black kids represent 30% of the kids who were referred. But when they're aging out, they represent 80% of the kids in independent living. So the deeper you get into the system, the more likely the Black child is to be overrepresented in the system. And the ideal, obviously, if any child is in the system, is to get them home as soon as possible. But that is less likely to happen with Black children. The removal of any child from his or her family, in almost all cases, is itself a highly traumatic event. And for Black people, for the Black family, it really is representative of a history, a legacy of how enslaved people were treated in terms of the breaking up of the family. And the family has gotten broken up by white people who owned them. It's gotten broken up by how people have not been allowed to have the kind of income that they can carry in order to maintain a family. So families are broken up by economic issues. They're broken up certainly by incarceration. And so you have a situation where there's a replaying of this kind of theme of breaking up families repeatedly. And these repeated moves through foster care is, again, another rupture, the limited contact that any child, particularly in non-kin placements, have with their families, and the lengthy stays in placement only add to the trauma. So it's very interesting because the research suggests that foster care itself contributes to greater psychological problems. When people have looked at kids who have had supported abuse allegations and not removed versus kids who have supported abuse allegations and removed, the kids who were removed actually do worse psychologically. We are not helping children, by and large, by removals. That's particularly true for neglect, which I was hoping to talk about further. So,
yes. Well, I'm grateful for you to shed this discussion. And obviously, we know each other from working in this system together for years, since that's where, I started my career in working in the Child Protective Service world as well. So I wanted to make sure that we represented this conversation because I don't know that people think about all of these different systems. Again, there's been so much focus on law enforcement, but when you start to look at all of these different systems and then see the connections even between them, it's overwhelming, to think about, how deep rooted, this all is. So Dr. Esquilin, and here in New Jersey in particular, our Child Protective Service system, was sued, and there was so much attention on our system about its reform efforts, and this in particular, the systemic racism embedded in it was one of the areas that the reform effort was supposed to fix. So here we are, far now, looking back on the reform effort and the pretty final package of it. So I think we, can all safely say it wasn't fixed, right?
I think that's
You
correct.
know, I don't think, I think that that's the obvious. So can you talk a little bit about why we think it still has not been fixed? Since even we knew that there was a problem, there was national attention on New Jersey's, systemic racism in our child protective service system, and still here we are.
So I guess I want to start by saying that my impression of the lawsuit was that it was never really addressing racism, although it was mentioned periodically.
Right.
And so it didn't, from my perspective, it never even from the beginning took a serious look at the question of racism and child welfare. For example, one of the big changes that happened was a decreased caseload. Well, that's important. I agree that's important from the point of view of the workers, but that doesn't tell you anything about what the content is about what's happening in the system. One of the major issues that's been a problem is that child welfare matters are handled within a judicial system that identifies parents as defendants. Now, this could be appropriate for cases where there's significant physical or sexual abuse, but it's highly questionable whether this is a model that's appropriate for neglect. And many people around the country have been talking about this issue. There have been some attempts in the child welfare system in New Jersey to divert some of the cases, families that are coming in, and see, that's a slip that I keep trying to fix, because it's like the prisoner slip that the person made that Twinkie was talking about. We keep referring to people as cases. People are not cases, they're people, okay? And that's and I just did it. So I'm just saying that, we're all brainwashed in this way. But there's been some attempts to divert people to other resources besides DCPP and the legal system, but that's not at all been sufficient. Because what's important to remember is that 70% of the families that get referred to DCP&P are being referred for things that are coded as neglect, not as abuse. And the parents who are substantiated or not as having committed either abuse or neglect are treated in the same way. They have to meet the same deadlines and standards and go through the same legal actions. So many times the initial referral is made by someone. It could be a medical person, it could be a school, it could be a psychologist. It's made by people who don't necessarily recognize, first of all, the impact of poverty and the relationship between poverty and neglect. They don't necessarily see they see it to the degree that they see the problems related to poverty. They tend to see it as the fault of the parent, the fault of the person for not having been able to provide for the child. And what happens is that, and they certainly tend not to recognize what I was talking about before, which is what happens to a family and to a child once they enter the system. So the findings of neglect overall, almost completely, are tied to problems associated with poverty. They include things like not bringing your child to the doctor because there's no medical coverage, leaving your child unattended because the parents are working and they can't afford childcare. And most significantly, and probably most egregiously, there are many instances of what's called environmental neglect. There's vermin in the house, the rodents are in the house, the walls are falling apart, there's lead poisoning because the walls are falling apart, there are fire traps, there's all this stuff. So if child welfare gets called into those homes, and I have to say, in the housing particularly, is something that's a product of living in a neighborhood of what we call concentrated poverty, which is primarily neighborhoods that are inhabited by Black and brown people. So people are poor and they are also Black and brown. And those are the neighborhoods that become concentrated poverty. Poor white people tend not to live in those kind of neighborhoods. So even if they don't have themselves economic resources, they tend to be living in more mixed environments economically. So when a family is referred to DCPP and they get involved and they find the children living in these horrendous circumstances, then they become kind of legally responsible and they can't leave the kids there. And if the parents cannot fix the problem immediately, which most of them cannot, then the child is removed. And once the child is removed, this becomes a legal matter, not a social service matter. And that's a big problem because most of these cases are really social service matters. They're economic, social service matters. So once you're in the legal system, then there's all these requirements about what you have to do. Oftentimes those requirements are so onerous that you end up having to leave your job in order to meet the requirements if you have a job. So, and people often talk about, people who are in the system talk constantly about all the appointments they have to keep that are not helpful to them. Everybody gets sent for parenting training. Well, if the real problem is economic, they don't need parenting training. They need to have the economic problem addressed. The other issue that I want to mention that's particularly, I think, egregious is the fact that we have made it almost impossible for all children, if they have to be removed. We've made it almost impossible because we've set standards, which I'll explain in a second, that make it impossible for many children not to go to kin. So they end up with non-kin. And that obviously produces increased trauma for the children and parents. Many of the what we call resource parents or foster parents, may themselves be Black, but they often are a step up economically from the families whose children they have, and they don't know the families. And there is this stereotype floating around in the society as a whole that anybody who loses their children to Child Protective Services must be a monster. So what happens is that the families who take the children in see themselves as kind of saving the child from this horrendous situation. They are not particularly invested in connecting with those parents, in helping to support those parents, in developing a liaison that the child can easily move between them emotionally as well as actually physically. And so, and why does this happen? Because many of the families of the people who get involved in child welfare are themselves impoverished, right? So grandma and auntie and whoever else are also living in similar circumstances to what mom may be living in. And in order for child welfare to legally place a child into a home, even a family home, it has to meet licensing standards. So what happens is the families that are willing to take the child don't meet licensing standards. And what's amazing is that we leave children in those circumstances all the time. We don't get involved in every child, but once the family legally gets involved in this way, we suddenly become responsible for them living in an adequate place. We're not responsible for the thousands, hundreds of thousands of children who are growing up in homes that are not fit to live in, right? But as soon as they become known to child welfare, now we have to, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be in homes that are fit to live in, but how come we're not concerned about all the children who are living in homes that are not fit to live in? How come we're not doing something about housing and economics? Right. Instead, we say, okay, now we have this child, we are legally responsible for this child, so we have to put this child in a home that's fit to live in, even though now we've created trauma by separating them from their families. There's something very crazy about the way this works.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about the neglect piece, the neglect issue, and then, thinking about the conversation with Sheriff Cureton about defunding the police, but, obviously using some of his language about more reallocating resources, that, so many of those children obviously are ending up in the criminal justice system and the legal systems and the family court systems, when the reality of it is maybe some of those funds could really help, support them. And when one of our hopes with this conversation tonight is, educating our community, is that, maybe reallocating some of those funds, is a good thing, right? It's something that is really something that we should embrace, and not at all to not, support, law enforcement having what they need to be able to protect our society, but at the same time, that there's a whole host of individuals getting stuck in that system that really don't belong there. Right. And I'm assuming the sheriff would probably speak to how that bogs down their system. Significantly.
Right.
So, Dr. Esquilin, before I, pose a question to the whole group, I just wanted to, obviously we're in the midst of this time of COVID, and we've seen the systemic racism connected to that, in particular to all of these other issues now what we're discussing. Could you speak a little bit about how we're seeing the impact of COVID on these systemic racism issues in the child protective service system?
Well, I understand that during COVID, since the pandemic, there's been a drop in the number of referrals to child welfare. Now, you can see that through several different lenses, right? I mean, you can see it through the lens that, oh, there are children being abused and they're not getting referred. You can also see it through, okay, so maybe these children didn't need to be referred to begin with. And so, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. The biggest challenges, as I understand it, that child welfare is having is maintaining that minimal contact on a weekly basis with their parents. The child welfare system is supposed to ensure that every child visits with their parents at least weekly. That's been a problem in COVID. It's been a problem for the workers are supposed to get out to visit every child on a monthly basis. They're supposed to visit the family from which the child came on a monthly basis. That's been very difficult in COVID. So a lot of families have been kind of out there, kind of flying without whatever services DCPP provides, and that may be a gift to some and may be a serious problem for others. DCPP has, I think they would acknowledge that they've not been able to do what has to be done, what they have an obligation to do in this time. They've lost a number of workers to the pandemic. I know that a number of workers have died who, early in the pandemic before the after the shutdowns, but when a lot of people had been infected, and we in New Jersey had a pretty high infection rate early in the pandemic. So I know that there were a number of losses of workers. So they've been kind of crippled in many ways by the pandemic in terms of their operations, for good or for bad. And I think they're trying now to kind of get back on some kind of regular board.
Well, thank you, Dr. Esquilin. I'm going to take a moment to bring our very patient Dr. Ottley into the discussion. I appreciate, we've heard, all these perspectives. Dr. Ottley is our final speaker to kind of have a focused discussion. Then we're going to bring everyone together to talk collectively. He is a race scholar, a social justice advocate, and he is from Washington, D.C. He's a native, and he personifies a perfect blend of scholarship, innovation, grit, professionalism, and heart. He has a strong reputation for student development, strategic planning, and empowering both educators and students to strive for the best version of themselves. He is unapologetically a natural-born leader who will prove to be essential to how the world views progressive education in the 21st century. And we're so grateful to have you with us as well, Dr. Ottley. Could you start by talking to us a little bit about the distinction between the terms non-racist and anti-racist, because they're different, and I just want to make sure that our viewers truly understand them and how they're meant to be.
Absolutely. Having me on your show. Thank you so much. And I didn't mind waiting because all of the guest panelists were saying some things that I really needed to hear. The old adage, iron sharpens iron. So I was sharpened tonight. So I really appreciated it. But to your question about anti-racism and not being racist, Helen, denial is the heartbeat of racism when we are in denial. And racism is this idea that one group of people is inferior to another group based on the color of their skin. And those people see racist thinking, how it manifests. And I see that racist thinking manifests in our policies, Helen, in our practices, in healthcare, in housing, in income. We heard Sheriff say tonight in law enforcement. Twinkie talked about the industry, movies, media. But anti-racist thinking manifests in policies and practices that lead to racial equity. And race makers categorize individuals, I believe, in distinct monolithic races. If you watch the news and you see a Black person getting arrested for stealing, many won't see that as an individual act, but instead an act done by a race of people. To be an anti-racist is to recognize there's no such thing as Black behavior, but instead narratives of individual behavior. And so when you say that you're not racist, according to a good friend and mentor, Dr. Ibram Kendi, he quotes, "It is a claim that signifies neutrality." You're in the middle. And Helen, I believe that you've not chosen a side. And so you're not siding with those who profess to be racist, and you're not siding with those who profess to be anti-racist. Essentially, you're complicit. And the definition of complicit is being involved in or knowing about a crime or some activity that is wrong.
Well, thank you for helping make that distinction for us. And, obviously, we've talked about the Child Protective Service system. We've talked about the film industry and law enforcement. And again, I know that your background is rooted in education. Is there any highlights you'd like to speak to about the systemic racism that, we know exists in our education system?
Oh, yeah, we heard it tonight. It's
right.
Intertwined, it's imbued since the beginning of time. The system was created for white people. It was designed to have white individuals with the construct of race to be superior and to succeed. The system was not designed for those who aren't of white persuasion to be successful. Now we have things like capitalism that has allowed individuals of all races to reach levels of success, but capitalism is not open and available to everyone. Everyone doesn't have access to it. And if that wasn't the case, look at our education system itself. We have affluent neighborhoods and we have non-affluent neighborhoods. We have school districts, laptops, and school districts that have smart boards. Then we have school districts that have no books, school districts that don't have any buses and students have to walk to class, walk to school. So even our school systems are divided and there aren't resources that are equitable. And so when we talk about being in a system that is equitable for all people, that means everybody has access to all things. Well,
thank you for that. And, we're kind of rounding into our last half hour of this conversation. And I thought this would be a good time to bring us all together and talk a little bit about, we have seen in the last few weeks, and, I think social media, has been a big piece of this is, folks being mobilized. We've seen many more people being out at protests. We've seen lots of social media posts. We saw so many people change their profile photo to a black box. So, what can we do? We've talked about all these, very, very, deeply embedded, racism issues that are in all of these key systems and that are clearly, impacting Black people, in such, horrific and tragic ways. And so what can we be doing, from each of your perspectives? What are some thoughts on how we take this moment where people seem to have galvanized and now, and I don't want to use the word dismantle again, because I understand, from, Twinkie's comments earlier, your thoughts around that, but how do we go from that moment of seeing all this activity and knowing now what we know about all of these systems and how deeply embedded racism is in them, and how can we make that shift? How can we make the systems not just about keeping, how we can make the systems be for all and have that equality? What are some thoughts you all have on that?
Helen, I have an initial thought, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I believe that the root problem of systemic racism is first denial, and then second, self-interest, right? And so the next step, I believe, is not arguing over who is superior. Whoever creates the standard of superiority will likely put themselves at the top. And so we must see that all races, and see all races, not be colorblind, but see all races. And in all the differences that we have, we move through life as if we're all on the same level. Nothing about me makes me superior to you. I know that I'm special, but nothing makes me more special than you. We both are special, right? And so I think one of the first steps is recognizing that some of us are still in denial of racism, and then racist policy that still exists are based upon self-interest.
Yeah, please, Sue. Anyone, please jump in. You're all muted on and off, which if you'd like to speak, just take yourself off mute when you're ready to talk.
So I want to make a couple of different comments. The first thing is that, you know, white people are always impatient. They expect to get what they want at the moment that they thought of it. And one of the things that I think we really need to recognize is that this is, you know, I've taken a lot of undoing racism trainings through the People's Institute. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. And one of the lessons that I've learned from that is this notion of no quick fix, that there has to be a really long-term commitment. You can't just put one initiative into place and expect that it's going to happen and that it's going to have a deep effect. I really do worry about, because people of color have been in this forever, right? White people kind of just discovered it, right? And so we tend as white people to say, okay, I found out about it, so therefore it must be important, and now I'm going to make it different, right? And I do worry about the level of activation among a lot of white people at this moment, that it's not going to be sustained. And I think people really need to understand that this is something that has to be sustained. And just on that topic, I want to mention, I watched two of the 4 episodes that Henry Louis Gates narrated about Reconstruction, where that is really couldn't be clearer, that 10 years, there was a lot done in 10 years, and look at how it was dramatically undone. 10 years of commitment is not enough, right? This is a long-term issue, and we have to wrap our heads around that. You know, the other thing that I just want to say is that I think white people, one of the things white people need to kind of also deal with is that, yes, we get something out of racism. There's no question about it. We get all kinds of privileges, but we also get hurt by it. And we haven't looked at that. We become inhumane. We lose feeling. We lose connectedness, even to other white people. We lose a sense, if you take a look at what's happened with the pandemic, the commodification of human beings, that it's not so important how many people die, it's just important that somebody makes money. If that isn't a representation in a larger sphere of racism, I don't know what is. How did we learn to commodify people like that? We bought and sold them, right? So now huge numbers of people, including white people, don't matter. It doesn't matter if they die. So that, to me, we are being hurt by the same kind of ideology that seems on the surface to benefit us, but actually injures us too. And I think we have to figure this out, because if we don't figure it out and we're not part of a sustained effort, we're going to have another situation like Reconstruction all over again.
Thank you, Dr. Esquilin. So Twinkie or Sheriff, if you'd like to say something, please feel free to take yourself off. Yes.
Woo, Sheriff, are you going or am I going to go?
You can have it. Or should I close?
You can close. You opened. I'm all for that.
No, we'll let you close. It's like you're fired up right now.
I just love what I'm hearing, and I'm so incredibly excited about it, and just hearing it. Just the words just ringing in my ears. What I'm dealing with on my end, just to share with you all, are people who have been so beaten down by visuals and by being told that they're nothing, that they write nothing. What we create is nothing. We have created a situation where even if you're in charge, you make the Black person the sidekick. Even if you are the person to write this fabulous story about this wonderful lead or this amazing man or person, you can't get that story made unless you add a white person into your film, i.e. hidden figures, in order to do things that were not even done, because half of the film you saw wasn't true. So you created a savior where there was none. You've created a running back and forth to the bathroom that never happened. And then you sit on a panel, the director, and say, well, I had to create some conflict. Well, the conflict is right there. You have Black women who went to college and high school, higher education during a time of Jim Crow, but you didn't want to touch that because that conflict would then implicate you or make you feel bad. You know, so the deprogramming that has to happen and the reprogramming. And in this industry, in my industry, there is not one Black or person of color that can greenlight a film. You literally have to go to yes, sis. You really have to go to a white person to get your film made. So if that's the situation that we're in, how do we tell those stories of our truth with that system in place? How do you do that? So it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work of dismantling. Right now, creating is everything. What was created during COVID was Versus, and where Versus is going to go, which was Swiss Beats and Dr. Dre, and how they are going to expand on that. And then creating platforms on social media and online so that we can shift our gaze from the networks and studios onto an online platform where we can then see our stories. So that is going to be a part of the change that I'm looking forward to in the entertainment industry.
Well, thank
Take it
you.
away, Sheriff.
Uh-oh. How do we make the change? I think we have to go back to basic history, American history. And you take the law enforcement, you take it to life. We kind of separated ourselves and you used it conveniently. Now I say that because you have American history inclusive of African-American history, but you never really hear the two intertwine. Now I'm gonna ring back down to law enforcement. If you don't know where I've been, you will never understand what I'm feeling then and there. I watched a movie sometime called Black Like Me. I want that movie to be an educational tool for everybody, especially in law enforcement, because you would never understand that treatment unless you actually wore those shoes. Whereas you may think what you're doing is not offensive to somebody. If you feel that same feeling like Black Like Me in that movie, and if you haven't had a chance, please see it, you will understand and internalize the regular or the everyday treatment and problems that the African-American community experience. I have this discussion all the time at work. Again, let us not be hoodwinked, if you want to say that, or completely believing that this culture is this way. I mean, that's a hard challenge. So I sit back and go back and forth with, it is American history, inclusive of African-American history. Don't close your eyes to the African-American history. Until you understand African-American history, you can appreciate the person you are talking to and dealing with then and there. And to me, that's the major crime we're faced with right now. A lot of groups, a lot of cultures want to exclude what happened in the 400 years of America. And I have to speak truth to power in that. You can't get away from slavery. You can't get away from lynching. It's all a reality. We're seeing it right now. But unless you have that moment to sit down and the willingness to have that discussion, that's going to be the only way I believe we're going to repair this system. And that's a true discussion law enforcement has to have. You have to put that whole historical component in it and worry about arresting and handcuffing later. That's going to be there. You've been given that power, but you need that more time to understand that different culture. I always use the example, in particular, like the Hispanic community. Love them. But if you ever learn the Hispanic community, you could talk to them, they may move their hands. Nothing aggressive, nothing offensive, but that's just part of their communication. If you don't understand that, as an officer, you may take it wrong and think that you're being challenged. You're possibly going to be assaulted. But until you have that type of education, the perception is going to be wrong right from the start.
Well, thank you for that, Sheriff. We have about 10 minutes. I thought it might be a good opportunity. I know that you all kind of answered my question there, but if any of you would like to take a moment to share a final thought, for our viewers, for each other, for this moment together, before I close us out. Dr. Ottley, anything you'd like to share?
I just have kind of some points that I wrote down while we were having this conversation. And again, I'm just grateful for you, Helen, and the panel that you put together. I was inspired, truly. I just think that those who are still listening by Facebook, have the courage, and that's the strength to do what is right in the face of all the wrong that you see. It takes courage to do that. And two, acknowledge the past pain and present injustice to build a bridge to equality. And then the third thing I would want to leave those who are viewing tonight is ask ourselves, who is benefiting from the norm, or who is benefiting from the standard, and work hard to help others also benefit.
Thank you, Dr. Ottley. Any other comments?
I just want to make one other comment. When we think about these different systems, and again, I really think about child welfare, but I think this is true certainly in education and maybe all the others, law enforcement. I don't know enough about entertainment and the media to make a comment, but I'm sure it's relevant there too. We can't just do this from the top down. We can't have a bunch of people who've been running the systems make the changes and expect there to be a change. There's got to be an involvement from the people who are impacted. You know, one of the challenges we've had, because at various points, there's been attempts, as you mentioned, Helen, to make changes in child protection. We've got to have parents who've been involved with the system in the room. We've got to have kids who've graduated from the system in the room. They're the people who can tell us what's really wrong and what needs to happen. But we tend not to involve those people. We tend to have all these talking heads deciding what they think ought to happen. People who already have been in power. So talk about who's gaining from it. If you've been sitting at the top, you've gotten something from it, right? So, and I would say clearly more white than black, but even black people who've been at the top. So we really need to pull into the conversations people who've been impacted.
Thank you, Dr. Esquilin. Twinkie?
I would love to say and share. Firstly, I can be found on Instagram at I am Twinkie Byrd, B-Y-R-D. I am Twinkie Byrd on IG. And I would love to share to everyone listening and all that will be listening or watching that this powerful tool right here, you can tell stories with. And it's time for us to empower our young people and empower people across the board. There's no age you're never too old to tell stories and to use this wonderful device that can make movies. I had a short film festival on my IG and I got 390 submissions for quarantine short films, and then also for what I call the Rise Up, No Justice, No Peace Challenge. So it's important to know no story is too small. I look forward to stories about foster care. I look forward to stories about the educational system. We need to tell our stories. You can shoot it, you can edit it, you can put music to it, and you can post it. It's time to tell our stories. Don't take them with you to the grave. Tell your stories. We need them, they're important.
Thank you, Twinkie. Sheriff, I guess you are going to close us out.
Well, I think we covered it all in one sense or another, but I was just typing, showing how appreciative I am to have opportunity to sit with this wonderful panel here. I mean, I've learned so much that, hey, Doc, I'm over here taking notes too, okay? As we type in that, everything that's being said, I'm incorporate. I got you, Twink. I'm incorporated in the narrative I want to share with everybody out there. And I think that's the key thing. Let's not keep it to ourselves. Let's embrace all of it and share it, and with hopes of touching someone. And like I said, this conversation right here has definitely touched me. And I hope you don't mind. I hope you don't have copyright or anything or patents, but I'm taking it and I'm committing a crime today. So thank you for the info.
Well, I think, that's, what the YWCA of Northern New Jersey was looking for with bringing all of you together and hosting this conversation is a learning opportunity for all of us. With that, obviously it also happened for our panel, but we're hoping that folks who watched also had some important aha moments and takeaways and, inspirations from all of, our wonderful experts and what they shared. Just so you know, the organizations that these 4 individuals are connected to, we will put in the comments section of this post the links so that you can find the groups that they're connected to. And we also will ask our panelists if there's any other information that you'd like to share with our viewers. Please, you know where to find us, email us, and we'll also link it here as well. For those of you watching, if there's someone in your life that you wished was watching this while it was live, don't despair. This is taped. It lives on our Facebook page. You can share this to your page. You can have your own watch party. You can invite people to come back and view it on our YWCA Northern New Jersey page. It's a wonderful opportunity to keep this conversation going. There was so much important information shared here today, and it's important to make sure that it ripples further than the folks that joined us this evening. So again, I really would like to, and I can see from our viewers, they're thanking you all for sharing your wisdom as well. I can't thank you enough. I also want to thank our team at the YWCA of Northern New Jersey who helped curate and put together our video person behind the scenes, everyone who makes conversations like this happen. For those of you watching, I want to encourage you all to continue to educate yourself. Obviously, that was noted as one of the true ways of impacting systemic racism. There's an individual journey we each have to go on, and we need to make sure that we do that. And it's not as if you read a book and you're done. It's the same way that this, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so we do ask everyone to, in earnest, to join us at the YWCA Northern New Jersey, stand shoulder to shoulder, so that we can together, ultimately impact our mission, which is to eliminate racism, which I know is a very lofty mission, but I really do believe that we can do it together. I also encourage you to vote. I know very often we know that, for me, it's going to the voting booth is very important. We know we have a big election year, but the presidency is not the only important election that's happening. They're happening on every level. They're happening locally in our communities. They're happening in our states. They're happening federally. We want everyone who is coming together, and we love seeing all this activity and people that are coming together as protests. But as I keep saying, keep walking to the voting booths in November, and make sure that you're putting people in office that reflect the values that you have. That when you see things that are wrong happening in our society, make sure you're putting people in office that will not sustain these systems, but people who actually will help us change these systems. So we do encourage you to do that. And also, it's not a small act. Some people may think it is, but complete your census. We are in the year and the time of our census, and we have until October. Take the time to put that information in. It is so important to make sure that everyone is counted in our communities. And we couldn't have seen that more now in the midst of this pandemic. That's how resources go to the education system, resources go to law enforcement, resources go to our hospitals, resources go to child protective services. They go to these systems because of how census, data is interpreted. And so if our communities are not accurately counted, it definitely has an impact. But I do encourage you, the YWCA of Northern New Jersey has a page on our website that has a number of resources. If you'd like to learn more, there's many places for you to start there. Some wonderful books, some wonderful documentaries, some websites to some wonderful organizations. And again, this is a journey, so one will lead you to another. But I encourage you to keep on that journey. Keep educating yourself, keep learning. Learn about organizations that are supporting dismantling systemic racism, that are about changing these systems, and support those organizations. Obviously, there's so many that are out there. YWCA of Northern New Jersey is definitely one of them, but there are many out there, and we encourage you to learn about them and to stand with those organizations, because this is how together, we will impact this work. I also encourage you to support Black businesses. Again, part of the way we are really going to impact racism is creating an economic equality, and part of the way that we can only do that is by supporting, learning about them. For those of you that live in our area, the YWCA does actually host the Bergen County Black Business Network under our umbrella. So we do encourage you to, get involved. The YWCA does have a racial justice task force. We encourage you to come stand with over 100 individuals and organizations in our area that is part of our task force, and learn and help us make changes help us start these conversations. Again, YWCA does this work every single day. We're grateful to have the relationships in our community to be able to hear what is needed and how we can stand shoulder to shoulder to, bring forth the education on these conversations, and grateful that folks feel safe and entrust us with information that helps us host events like this. So with all of that, again, thank you to our speakers. So grateful for all of you to share your personal experiences and open up your worlds to us to help us learn. Thank you to everyone who watched this evening. And please don't let the knowledge and the information that you took from this stop with you. Use it as an opportunity to start a conversation. Use it as an opportunity to share this feed, with folks in your life. And I think, Twinkie had a great suggestion to take this and, share a story about how this has impacted, how you've been impacted. And, we wish everyone to stay healthy and stay well during this time, and look forward to more conversations. Please please let us know what else, is important for, us to help facilitate in our community. We're here to support. And thank you all. Be well.